I stood in the dark of that attic, my back against a sloped wall, wearing my niece's gray hooded sweatshirt over my own shoulders, and listened to her mother's footsteps come up the stairs. In a few seconds, Denise was going to open that door, look at the shape sitting where her daughter had sat for 6 years, and believe for just long enough that she was looking at Sophie. Before I tell you how I got to that attic, thank you for being here with me. If this story means something to you, I would love to know where you are watching from tonight. And if you find value in stories like this, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. A quick note before we start. Some names and identifying details in this story have been changed to protect the people involved, but what happened and what it cost is real. My name is Walter Doyle. Everyone has always called me Walt. I am 65 years old, and I spent 33 years as a building contractor in a small town outside Grand Rapids, Michigan. I know how houses are put together. I know where the load-bearing walls are hiding behind fresh drywall, where a floor plan does not quite match the blueprint, where somebody sealed something off and painted over the seam hoping nobody would look closely enough to notice. It is a strange thing to carry that kind of eye into your own family. You start noticing the places where the story does not quite match the structure. My sister Denise and I were close once, the way siblings are close before life gets complicated. She is 4 years younger than me. Our parents passed when we were in our 30s, and for a while, Denise and I were each other's whole family, along with her husband Mark and their daughter Sophie, my only niece. Sophie was a bright kid, curious in the way that makes a room feel lighter when she walks into. She used to follow me around job sites when she was small, asking why beams went one direction instead of another, why some walls could come down and others could not. I taught her the difference between a wall that holds up a house and a wall that just divides a room. I did not know back then how much that lesson would matter later. I still remember one afternoon in particular, when she was maybe 8 or 9, standing in the frame of a half-built house with sawdust in her hair, asking me how builders knew, before the walls even went up, which ones would need to be strong enough to hold the whole roof, and which ones were just there to make separate rooms. I told her you planned that from the very beginning, on paper, long before anyone ever lives inside the house. And if you get it wrong, if you knock down the wrong wall later because you did not understand what it was really holding up, everything above it can come down without any warning at all. She thought about that for a long time, the way she thought about most things, and then asked me if people were like that too, if some people in a family were the walls holding everything up without anyone quite noticing. I did not have a good answer for her then. I think about that conversation more than almost any other memory I have of her as a little girl. When Sophie was 11, Mark and Denise divorced. It was not an easy split. Mark had wanted more independence for Sophie as she got older, more time with friends, more of a normal childhood outside the house. Denise wanted the opposite, and after the divorce, she got full custody and with it, full control over how Sophie's life would look from that point forward. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for you to understand how something like this can happen inside a family that looks, from the outside, like any other family having an ordinary hard time. After the divorce, Denise and I had a falling out of our own. She accused me of taking Mark's side, of undermining her in front of Sophie, of not respecting her decisions as a mother. I pushed back too hard, said things I regret, and for the better part of 2 years, we barely spoke. That gap, that silence between a brother and a sister who used to talk every week, turned out to be exactly the kind of space where something terrible could grow without anyone close enough to see it. By the time Sophie turned 12, Denise had remarried, a quiet, soft-spoken man named Roger who worked in regional sales and traveled more than he was home. And by the time Sophie turned 12, Denise had also started telling a very specific story about her daughter, one that would not fully unravel for 6 long years. The story was this. Sophie had a rare autoimmune condition, something Denise described differently depending on who she was talking to, sometimes a severe allergy disorder, sometimes an immune deficiency, sometimes something vaguer still, that made regular school unsafe for her, made normal social contact risky, made it necessary, tragically necessary, for Sophie to be homeschooled in a controlled environment, away from the germs and stress of the outside world. I remember the first time I heard this explanation, at a stiff, careful lunch Denise and I had after almost 2 years of silence, an attempt at repairing things now that enough time had passed. I remember thinking it sounded serious and sad, and I remember feeling guilty for the distance between us, guilty enough that I did not ask the follow-up questions a healthier relationship would have made room for. What hospital diagnosed her? What specialist was managing her care? Why I had never heard about any of this before the divorce, when Sophie had been, by every account, an ordinary, healthy, energetic kid running around job sites asking me about load-bearing walls. I did not ask those questions for a long time. That is something I have had to live with. Birthday cards became my only real thread to Sophie during those years. I sent one every year, and for the first 2 years I got one back, in Sophie's own looping, careful handwriting, thanking me for the gift, telling me small things about her days. Then, starting around the 3rd year, the handwriting on the return cards began to change. Smaller, tighter, less like a child's hand and more like someone copying a child's hand without quite matching the rhythm of it. I noticed. I told myself I was imagining things, that kids' handwriting changes as they get older, that grief and distance were making me paranoid about a sister I had already hurt once by assuming the worst of her. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it is at the center of how something like this survives inside a family for 6 years. Assuming the worst of her. We are taught, especially with the people we love, to give the benefit of the doubt, to reach for the kindest explanation first. Denise understood that instinct in the people around her better than anyone I have ever known. She built an entire 6-year story on top of it. The break in that story came from a leaking roof. 2 winters ago, Denise called me, the first time she had asked me for anything in years, saying she had ice damming above the 2nd floor and needed someone she trusted to look at it before it caused real damage. I said yes, before I had even finished processing the fact that she had called me at all. I told myself this was a chance to rebuild something. I did not know it would become something else entirely. I want to pause the story here, because I think you deserve to make your own guess before I go further. What do you think I found when I climbed into that house to fix the roof? Write your theory in the comments below. I will tell you if you were close by the end of this. The house was same one Denise and Roger had lived in since shortly after the wedding, a 2-story colonial with a steep roofline that made the ice damming worse than it needed to be. Denise let me in, made polite conversation about work and weather, and led me toward the stairs that went up to the attic access, which was the fastest route to the section of roof that needed attention. At the top of the stairs, there was a door I had not expected. Not the simple pull-down attic ladder most houses of that era have, but a real door, solid with a lock on the outside, the kind of lock you install on a shed or a workshop, not on an interior room inside you. I asked Denise about it, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. She said it was for storage security, that Roger kept some work equipment up there and did not want it wandering off. It was a reasonable enough answer on its own. It was the kind of answer that only becomes strange when you notice, the way I noticed without fully understanding what I was noticing yet, that there was a second, smaller lock lower on the door frame. positioned at a height that made no sense for keeping tools secure, and every kind of sense for keeping something or someone from opening that door from the inside. Denise unlocked it for me, and I stepped into a space that had clearly been finished out far beyond what a storage attic needed. Insulated walls, a small window painted over from the inside so no light passed through it clearly, a twin bed pushed against the far wall, made up neatly, almost too neatly, the way a bed looks when someone has learned to make it a certain way because someone else expects it that way every single day. I remember standing just inside that doorway for a moment, running my eyes across the room the way I automatically assess any space I am about to work in, checking sight lines, checking what a person's daily movement through a room actually looks like versus what it is supposed to look like. There was a worn path in the carpet leading from the bed to the small window, the kind of path that only forms from months, maybe years, of someone standing in the same spot repeatedly, looking out through glass that had been painted over specifically so there would be nothing worth looking at. There were things in that room that did not belong in a storage space. A stack of drawings, careful, detailed pencil sketches of birds and trees, and more than once, of a man standing on a rooftop that I recognized, with a jolt that still catches in my chest when I think about it now, as one of my own old job sites. A small shelf of books, well worn, the kind of worn that comes from being read many times by someone with nothing else to do with their hours. And on the floor near the bed, half hidden under a folded blanket, a single sock, the kind that would fit a teenage girl, not a grown man doing sales work who traveled 3 weeks out of every month. Denise stood in the doorway behind me the entire time, and I remember, even in the middle of my own rising alarm, noticing how calm she seemed, how practiced her posture was, arms crossed loosely, weight settled easily on one hip, the stance of someone who had stood in that same doorway explaining that same room to other people many times before and had never once needed to raise her voice to be believed. She asked, in a tone so light it almost worked on me, whether I thought the roof damage would take long to repair, as though we were standing in any ordinary attic discussing any ordinary leak. I did not say anything about the room in that moment. I want to be honest about that too, because I have asked myself many times since whether I should have said something right then, confronted Denise on the spot, refused to leave until she explained herself fully. Instead, I finished assessing the roof damage, gave her a reasonable estimate for the repair, and drove home with my hands so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles ached by the time I pulled into my own driveway. I called Sophie's old cell number that night, the one I still had saved from years earlier, not expecting anything. It rang twice and disconnected. I told myself it had been reassigned to someone else long ago. Some part of me, the part that had spent 33 years learning to trust what a structure was quietly telling you underneath what people said about it out loud, did not believe that explanation for a second. Over the following weeks, I started doing what I know how to do, which is check the paperwork behind a story before I trust the story itself. I called the Michigan Department of Education's homeschool reporting line, using my professional credentials to ask a general question about registration requirements, and learned that homeschool families in our county are required to file basic notice of intent paperwork with the local school district. I made a records request, citing a general research interest, and found no filing under Sophie's name, not for that year, not for any year going back to when Denise said the homeschooling had begun. I checked hospital billing databases I had access to through a friend who worked in medical records administration, someone who owed me a favor from a home renovation years earlier, and found no record of ongoing treatment for any autoimmune or immune deficiency condition under Sophie's name at any hospital system in the state. There were 2 records, both old, both predating the divorce, for entirely unrelated childhood illnesses, an ear infection and a broken wrist. Nothing that matched 6 years of a supposedly serious, ongoing medical condition severe enough to require total isolation from the outside world. I sat with that discrepancy for a long time. A rare illness with no doctor, a homeschool arrangement with no registration, a daughter with no recent photographs on social media, no mentions among old family friends, no trace of an actual life being lived anywhere except inside Denise's careful, consistent, endlessly repeated. My first instinct, and I regret this now because it cost valuable time, was to suspect Roger. It made a certain kind of sense to me at the time. He was the one who traveled constantly, conveniently absent for long stretches. He was the one whose name Denise had used to explain the lock, the equipment excuse, the storage story. I spent nearly a month quietly looking into him instead of her, checking his employment records, his travel schedule, even sitting outside a hotel where his sales route took him 1 week, trying to understand what kind of man could be complicit in something like this. I want to walk you through that month, because I think it matters for understanding how easy it is to point your suspicion at the wrong person, when the right one has spent years building a reputation as the victim in her own story, rather than its author. Roger sold industrial cleaning equipment to manufacturing plants across 3 states, a job that kept him on the road roughly 3 weeks out of every 4. I followed his general route for parts of 2 of those weeks, telling myself I was simply gathering information, though looking back I think some part of me wanted very badly to find him guilty, because a controlling stepfather was a simpler, more familiar shape of villain than the one I was slowly starting to suspect I might actually be dealing with. I watched him check into an unremarkable business hotel outside Toledo, watched him meet with 2 separate clients over the course of an afternoon, watched him eat a solitary dinner at a chain restaurant attached to the hotel, scrolling through his phone the way tired traveling salesmen do everywhere. Nothing about him looked like a man hiding a monstrous secret. He looked like a man who had learned to be somewhere else as often as possible. I finally worked up the nerve to have a real conversation with him during one of his brief stretches at home, catching him alone in the driveway one evening, while Denise was at a church committee, meeting she rarely missed. I asked him carefully, without revealing what I had seen in the attic, general questions about Sophie, how she was doing, whether her treatment seemed to be helping, small conversational openings that any engaged stepfather should have been able to answer with some specificity. Roger's answers were vague, in a way that told me almost as much as a direct confession would have. He said Denise handled all of that she was the medical one in the family, that he tried to give Sophie her space and not intrude on what he called her private recovery process. When I asked, as casually as I could manage, when he had last actually sat down and had a real conversation with Sophie, he paused for long enough that the silence itself became an answer, and then said something about respecting boundaries that sounded less like a father's wisdom, and more like a man reciting a rule he had been given rather than one he had arrived at himself. What I found, over that month, surprised me in ways I had not expected. Roger's travel schedule was extensive and verifiable, real client meetings, real hotel stays, a genuine, demanding sales job that kept him away from home for exactly the reasons Denise had always claimed. And in the handful of conversations I managed to have with him, carefully, without revealing what I had seen in that attic, I found a man who seemed almost willfully unaware of the details of his own household, someone who had learned, I would come to understand later, not to ask too many questions about a wife who did not tolerate being questioned. I asked him once, near the end of that driveway conversation, whether he had ever actually been inside the attic room himself. He looked at me strangely and said of course he had. It was his equipment storage after all, and described, without any hesitation, exactly the kind of generic tools and boxes you would expect to find in an ordinary attic. I did not correct him. I did not tell him what I had actually seen up there. I understood in that moment that he genuinely believed his own answer, which meant either Denise had staged the room differently for him at some point, or Roger had simply never looked closely enough in 6 years to notice what his own eyes should have told him. I still do not know, even now, which of those two explanations is worse. Roger was not the architect of what was happening in that house. He was, in his own smaller and still troubling way, another person who had learned to look away rather than confront what he did not want to see clearly. That is its own kind of failure. It is not the same failure as building the room in the first place. It was Denise. It had always been Denise. I made one attempt before I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with to reach Sophie directly. I drove to the house on a day I knew Denise had a standing hair appointment, timed carefully from something Roger had mentioned once without realizing its significance, and I left a note tucked into the mail slot, addressed simply to Sophie, telling her that her Uncle Walt was thinking about her, that he remembered the job sites and the questions about load-bearing walls, and that if she ever needed anything, anything at all, she should know he was not far away. I do not know if that note ever reached her. What I do know is that 3 days later, Denise called me, her voice sharp in a way I had rarely heard from her, accusing me of trespassing on her property, of harassing her family, of not respecting the medical privacy her daughter was entitled to. She told me, in a tone that made my chest go cold, that if I came near her house again without an invitation, she would involve a lawyer and pursue a restraining order. The lock on the attic door was changed within the week. I know because I drove past once late at night and saw a locksmith's van still parked in the driveway. I understood with total clarity that I had tipped my hand too early, and that whatever I did next needed to be built on something stronger than a hunch and a stack of missing paperwork. I went to Child Protective Services first, because that seemed like the responsible thing to do, the thing that would not require me to take matters into my own hands. I gave a caseworker everything I had, the missing homeschool registration, the absent medical records, the locked door, the objects in the room that did not belong to an adult man's storage space. The caseworker was sympathetic, thorough in her questions, and honest with me about the limits of what she could do. I sat across from her in a small government office with beige walls and a single potted plant that had clearly seen better decades, watching her write down everything I told her in a careful, practiced hand. And I remember feeling, for the first time in months, something close to relief. I had finally handed this to someone with actual authority to act, someone whose job it was to walk into that house and ask the questions I no longer had any legal standing to ask myself. I drove home that night almost convinced the worst of it was over. Denise, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at managing exactly this kind of scrutiny. When the caseworker made a scheduled visit, Denise presented a private tutor's letterhead, a woman claiming to provide in-home instruction, along with a folder of medical documents from an out-of-state clinic that, upon later investigation, turned out to be connected to a physician whose license had been under review for questionable diagnostic practices, the kind of doctor who writes letters supporting conditions that are difficult to verify and even harder to disprove. Denise presented Sophie herself for a supervised conversation, coached, calm, saying all the right things about feeling safe and cared for, using language that sounded, to an outside ear, like a girl who understood and accepted her own medical situation. I later learned, piecing it together from records the investigators eventually obtained, that Denise had rehearsed that conversation with Sophie for nearly 2 full days beforehand, walking her through exactly which words to use, which questions to expect, which tone of voice would sound most convincingly calm rather than coached. She had told Sophie, according to what Sophie shared with me much later, that if she said the wrong thing, if she made the caseworker suspicious, the state would take her away from her mother entirely and place her with strangers, a fear that Denise had cultivated carefully over years specifically for a moment like this one. Fear, I have come to understand, was the true architecture of that house, far more than any lock ever was. The case was closed as unsubstantiated within 6 weeks. I remember sitting in my truck outside my own house after getting that news, feeling something close to despair for the first time since I had climbed into that attic. Denise had spent 6 years building not just a locked room, but an entire structure of plausible explanations around it, load-bearing walls of her own, each one reinforcing the next, each one designed specifically to survive exactly the kind of inspection I had just watched fail. I understood then that I was not going to out-argue this. I was going to have to outbuild it. I reached out to Patricia first, because I remembered her from years earlier, before the divorce, as someone Denise had genuinely trusted, a retired school counselor with 30 years of experience reading exactly the kind of coached, careful answers that had fooled the first caseworker. I found her number through a mutual friend and called her on a Tuesday evening, uncertain how she would react to hearing from me after so long, uncertain whether she would even believe what I was about to tell her. She listened to the entire story without interrupting once, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the line before she spoke again. She told me she had wondered, more than once over the years, why Sophie had simply vanished from every school function, every neighborhood gathering, every trace of the ordinary social fabric a 12-year-old girl should have been part of. She told me she had asked Denise about it once, gently, at a mutual friend's retirement party, and had been given the same illness explanation I had already heard, and had, to her lasting regret, accepted it the way everyone else had, because Denise told it so consistently, so calmly, so completely without the nervous inconsistency you expect from someone lying. Patricia agreed to help immediately, and over the following weeks, she became the piece of this that I. She still had contacts within the school district from her working years, people who trusted her judgment enough to quietly confirm, off the record, that no homeschool paperwork had ever crossed their desks for Sophie, corroborating what I had already found through my own record's request, but adding weight to it that came from an actual professional inside the system, rather than an outside relative with an obvious personal stake. More importantly, Patricia found a way to reach Sophie directly, something I had failed to do on my own. She remembered that Denise's household still used a particular school supply and textbook delivery service, one that had operated in the district for over a decade, and that deliveries for homeschool families were sometimes accepted directly by the student rather than the parent, especially for older students expected to manage more of their own materials. Patricia arranged, through a former colleague who still worked with that delivery service, to have a textbook delivered to the house with a folded note tucked inside its back cover, addressed simply to Sophie, explaining who Patricia was, mentioning my name and the job sites and the load-bearing walls in a way she hoped Sophie would recognize as genuinely coming from people who remembered her real childhood, and asking carefully whether Sophie wanted help. The answer came back 3 weeks later, through the same delivery channel, folded into the spine of a returned workbook. I still have that note. Sophie's handwriting in it was uneven, urgent, nothing like the careful, controlled cards I had been receiving for years. She wrote that she was not sick, that she never had been, that she had asked to go to real school starting when she was 12, and her mother's answers had gotten stranger and more frightening every time she asked again, until she stopped asking at all because asking made things worse. She wrote that she remembered me, remembered the job sites, remembered asking about walls. She wrote 3 words at the very end of that note that I have not been able to forget since. Please don't wait. That note is what turned this from a suspicion I was gathering evidence for into an obligation I could no longer treat carefully or slowly. Patricia and I spent the following 4 months building the plan together, piece by piece, the way you frame a house, checking and rechecking that each part could bear the weight of what would come next. Patricia maintained the fragile, secret channel of communication through the delivery service, confirming details, timing, what Sophie would need to know and when. I focused on the physical planning, the roof repair that would give me legitimate, scheduled access to the attic, the window that could be opened from inside without alerting anyone below, the ladder I could position under cover of the work itself, the 2 streets over where Patricia would wait with her car running. I also spent those months building the case file the investigators had told me they needed, the paperwork trail proving the absence of school registration, the absence of medical records, the physician whose license was under review, each document a beam I was quietly setting into place before the day when the whole structure would finally need to hold real weight. Once Sophie's note confirmed what I had suspected, Patricia agreed to make a formal, detailed report to the state's more specialized child welfare investigative unit, the one that handles cases involving suspected medical child abuse, a pattern sometimes called factitious disorder imposed on another, where a caregiver fabricates or exaggerates a child's illness, not for financial gain, but for the identity, sympathy, and total control that caring for a supposedly. Her decades of professional credibility with the district carried real weight with investigators in a way my own report, coming from an estranged relative, had not. That report, paired with the paperwork I had already gathered, was enough to get a more serious, more coordinated investigation opened, one that involved not just a single caseworker's visit, but a joint effort between Child Protective Services and the local police department's Family Crimes Unit. But even with that in motion, the investigators told me plainly that they needed something more immediate, more undeniable, something that would let them act quickly rather than wait through weeks of legal maneuvering, while Denise, inevitably, found another set of explanations to hold the structure together a little longer. I asked them what would help. They told me carefully that if there were ever a way to get direct, real-time evidence, a recorded conversation, an unguarded moment where Denise's own words revealed the truth without a lawyer or a coached explanation standing between her and the camera, that kind of evidence moves a case forward faster than almost anything else. That is how I ended up back at that house, on a day I had arranged weeks in advance under the pretense of finishing the roof repair I had started 2 winters earlier, wearing a small recording device clipped inside my jacket, and carrying in my truck a gray hooded sweatshirt I had bought at a store 2 towns over, chosen specifically because it was close enough in size and color to something Patricia, through careful, gentle contact reestablished with Sophie through a school supply delivery arrangement Denise had unknowingly allowed, had confirmed Sophie actually owned and wore. The plan itself was simple in its structure, even though everything underneath it had taken the better part of a year to build. I would go up to finish the roof work as scheduled. Sophie, alerted in advance through a note folded inside a textbook Patricia had arranged to have delivered, would be ready, at a specific time, to leave through the attic window onto the section of roof I would already have exposed for repairs. Down a ladder I would position in advance under cover of the work itself, into a car Patricia would have waiting 2 streets over. And I would remain behind in that attic room, in the dim light, wearing Sophie's sweatshirt, seated where she always sat, my back to the door, buying whatever minutes I could before Denise realized her daughter was gone. I will tell you honestly that the day itself unfolded slower and stranger than I had imagined it in all those months of planning. I arrived mid-morning with my truck full of legitimate roofing materials, greeted Denise with the same careful, ordinary politeness I had practiced in my head a dozen times on the drive over, and spent the first 2 hours actually working, tearing out damaged shingles, exposing the section of decking beneath, because the last thing I could afford was for the work itself to look rushed or incomplete if anyone came looking later. Around 1 in the afternoon, with Denise occupied downstairs on a call I later learned was with her church committee, I climbed up through the newly exposed section of roof, and moving as quietly as 33 years of careful work on old houses has taught me to move, opened the attic window from the outside using a thin release tool I had practiced with beforehand on an identical window frame in my own garage. Sophie was already waiting, dressed exactly as Patricia and I had planned, her small backpack containing only the drawings she could not bear to leave behind. I remember her hands shaking as she climbed through that window onto the exposed section of roof, and I remember whispering to her, the way I used to when she was small and unsteady on a ladder rung, that I had her, that the footing was solid, that she just needed to trust the next step the way she trusted every step after it. I walked her down the ladder myself, watched her cross the yard toward the tree line where Patricia's arranged route would take her the 2 streets over, and I did not breathe easily again until the message came through on my phone. 3 words Patricia had promised to send the moment Sophie was safely in the car. She is safe. Only then did I climb back up through that window myself, pull the hooded sweatshirt on over my own jacket, and settle onto the edge of that narrow bed to wait, the recording device already running inside my jacket, my back to the door, my heart working harder than it had in years of physical labor on rooftops twice as steep as that one. I thought about every job site Sophie had followed me across as a little girl, every question she had asked about why one wall could come down safely and another could not, and I understood, more clearly than I ever had, that I was sitting inside the answer to her own question now, in a wall that had been built for exactly the wrong reason, to hold something up that should never have needed holding at all. The door opened. Denise's voice came first, soft, the voice she must have used every single day for 6 years. "Sophie, honey, I brought you something to eat before your uncle finishes up outside." I did not turn around right away. I let the silence stretch the way I have learned to let silence stretch when someone needs to fill it themselves. "Sophie," she said again, a thin thread of uncertainty entering her voice now, the voice of someone who has said the same reassuring words so many times that the absence of a familiar response feels instantly, physically wrong. I turned around then. I watched something collapse behind my sister's eyes in real time, the particular, total collapse of a story meeting the structure it was never built to survive. She did not scream. She did not immediately deny anything. She stood in that doorway with a small plate of food in her hands and asked me, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it on the recording later, where her daughter was. I told her the truth, that Sophie was already somewhere safe. That everything Denise had told me, told Roger, told every caseworker and school district and family friend for 6 years, was about to be measured against a locked door, a homeschool registration that had never existed, and medical records that told an entirely different story than the one she had spent years perfecting. What she said next, standing in that doorway, believing for those first several seconds that she was still only speaking to me, is not something I am going to repeat here in detail, out of respect for what Sophie has since asked me not to share publicly. I will tell you that it confirmed everything the investigators needed. Not a story about protecting a sick child from a dangerous world, but something far more painful and far more human in its selfishness. A woman who had built an entire identity around being the mother of a fragile, needful child, who could not tolerate the ordinary, healthy, independent Sophie, had begun asking for around the time she turned 12, and who found it easier in the end to make her daughter's world smaller than to make room inside herself for a daughter. She stood in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, the plate of food still balanced in her hands, and when she finally set it down on the small dresser beside the bed, her hands were shaking badly enough that it rattled against the wood. She asked me again, quieter this time, whether Sophie was safe. I told her yes. She asked whether Sophie hated her. I did not answer that question, because it was not mine to answer, and because I understood, watching my sister's face in that moment, that some part of her already knew what the honest answer would eventually be. I told her the investigators would be arriving soon, that Patricia had already made the call the moment Sophie's message confirmed she had safely reached the car 2 streets over, and that whatever came next was no longer something either of us could control through careful explanations or coached conversations. I watched something in Denise finally stop performing, for what might have been the first time in 6 years, in front of anyone at all. The investigation moved quickly after. Denise was arrested within the week, charged with unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment, and, once investigators traced the pattern back through years of unnecessary medical claims and fabricated diagnoses, additional charges connected to the factitious disorder pattern the specialized unit had suspected from the beginning. Roger was investigated as well, though ultimately not charged criminally, found by the district attorney's office to have been genuinely unaware of the extent of what was happening in his own home, a finding I have complicated feelings about even now, because unawareness inside your own house is its own kind of choice, made slowly, over many small moments of not asking the harder question. The weeks immediately after Sophie's rescue were harder than I had expected them to be, even after everything I had already prepared myself for. She had spent 6 years learning to move through a small, controlled world, and the ordinary largeness of an unrestricted life, grocery stores, crowded sidewalks, other teenagers her age moving in loud, unpredictable groups, overwhelmed her in ways that took months of patient adjustment to work through. She saw a trauma therapist twice a week, someone Patricia helped us find, a specialist experienced with cases of prolonged isolation and medical child abuse, and slowly, in small increments I tried not to measure too closely because measuring made the slowness feel unbearable, Sophie began reclaiming pieces of an ordinary life. A library card. A part-time job at a hardware store 2 miles from my house, where she reorganized the fastener aisle so thoroughly in her first month that the manager gave her a raise. A single close friend from her therapy group, a girl named Inez, who had survived a very different but similarly isolating childhood, and who Sophie now spends most weekends with. Sophie is 18 now, technically an adult by the time all of this came to light, which meant she was able to make her own decisions about where to live and how to move forward, decisions no caseworker or family court could make for her. She lives with me now, in the guest room I finished building myself the same month the investigation closed, and some evenings she still asks me questions about construction, about which walls hold weight and which ones only divide a room, and I answer every single one of them slowly, carefully, The way you answer a question from someone who is finally allowed to ask as many as she wants. She has started talking, tentatively, about enrolling in community college classes in the spring, something in architecture or structural design. And I will admit that when she first mentioned it, I had to step out onto the back porch for a few minutes before I trusted my voice enough to tell her how proud that would make me. She still draws, the same careful, detailed pencil sketches I found scattered across that attic floor 2 winters ago, though now she draws them at the kitchen table in full daylight, and she has started signing them, small and neat in the corner, the way an artist signs work she intends other people to eventually see. Denise's trial concluded 4 months ago. She pled to a reduced set of charges in exchange for a lengthy probation period, mandatory long-term psychiatric treatment, and a permanent no-contact order that Sophie herself requested, and the court granted without hesitation. I am told, secondhand, through Roger, who still calls occasionally out of what I think is guilt he has not fully worked through himself, that Denise has expressed remorse in her mandated therapy sessions. Real remorse, the kind that comes only after a structure has been fully exposed and can no longer protect the person hiding behind it. I do not know what to do with that information. I am not sure remorse that arrives only after the walls come down means quite the same thing as the kind that might have arrived on its own, years earlier, if anyone inside that house had ever felt safe enough to ask the harder question first. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is that isolation dressed up as protection is still isolation, and a family story that only ever comes from one voice, repeated consistently enough, for long enough, can start to feel like the truth even to the people closest to it. I loved my sister. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone whose worst choices you can now see clearly enough to name. But I have learned that love without honest questions is not the same thing as protection, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to stop assuming the best of them long enough to actually look. If this story affected you, I would be grateful if you shared your own thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever sensed that something in your family did not add up, long before you had the proof to say so out loud? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want more stories like this one, please consider subscribing so you do not miss what I have to share next. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Ask the harder questions. Look a little closer at the walls that do not quite match the story you have been told about them. A final note before you go. Certain names, locations, and identifying details in this story have been altered to protect the privacy of everyone involved, including Sophie herself. If you or someone you know has concerns about a child's safety or well-being, please contact your local Child Protective Services agency or law enforcement directly.